Okay, hello everyone. Welcome. This week, as you can see here, we're going to focus on Tommy Orange's award-winning novel, There, There. I hope, despite this novel grappling with some heavy, often sad topics made available through its whole panoply of characters, that you are nonetheless enjoying it as a read. I'm excited about this novel. I always am when teaching it because Orange is covering some deep subject matter in an often very poetic way at times. His writing, I think, enters the realm of poetry. Has one foot staggered between the realm and landscape of novel writing, and then as well as the language is building towards uh, landing in the realm of poetics. One could even choose that as a topic for your short essay number two, which is coming up later in the semester, and you would approach that sort of the way Orange utilizes elements of poetry within there is X, Y, and Z. Okay, the novel, you're going to have plenty of subject matter to write on this novel when we get to this lecture and our next lecture, so don't worry about that. The novel, as Orange has been quoted as saying, is focused on the topic of sadness, but tempered with hope, and can even be tragic at times to its many characters. It, as I'm sure you've picked up on, is a complex novel whereby Orange is able to successfully weave a whole host of characters, mostly Native Americans, who are all facing some barrier to completeness or fulfillment within their respective lives as well as within their interconnected lives. So they're highly individuals, but they're also connected within this narrative, a web of characters within this narrative. We'll address some of the major characters that we just spoke about and themes within the novel later in the lecture. But let's first get to know Tommy Orange himself in order to give greater context and even subtext to his novel, There, There. Okay, Tommy Orange. Just a quick bio. Is a recent graduate. I graduated a couple years ago from an MFA program at the Institute of American Indian Arts. He's a 2014 MacDowell Fellow and a 2016 Writing by Writers Fellow. He is enrolled a member of the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes of Oklahoma. He was born and raised in Oakland, California, and currently lives in Angels Camp, California. As always, it's befitting to hear the authors speak on behalf of their own work. So in that spirit, let's listen to two videos. One's 6 minutes, the other one is 10 minutes, so a combination of 16 minutes. I found where Orange talks about the novel's themes, even its inception.
You're from a people who took and took and took and took, and from a people taken. You're both and neither. That's how author Tommy Orange sums up the paradox of being Native American and white, and the complexity of that identity in the US today. His novel, There, There, has had praise from author Margaret Atwood, the Pulitzer Committee, and is a New York Times bestseller. Tommy joins us in the studio to tell us more. Hi, thanks for coming on the show.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Well, I'd like to start by talking about the title of your book. There suggests that it's about place, but place ends up being quite a complicated idea in this novel. Can you tell us why?
So it's about people from Oakland, California, in the U.S., and Native people, if they're from the city, the from is tricky here because a lot of Native people relocated in the 50s and 60s from reservations. And as you know, reservations were something that were set up and people were from somewhere else before that. So people in the book are struggling with identity and what it means to be from a place and feel like you belong somewhere. And this is a Gertrude Stein quote, and she's talking about how her childhood home was no longer recognizable because it was developed over. So Native people are trying to understand in the book what it means to belong in Oakland and to a country that was taken over and taken from those people, and what the original land may have looked like is no longer recognizable. And these people are struggling with their identity and what it means to belong. And so the there is like sort of a supra location. And then also kind of the irony of it not being a comforting book either.
Yeah.
Like there is the sort of the...
Yeah, it's not so reassuring, is it? Now, in your book, you mentioned that some of the stereotypes that surround Native Americans, pop culture depictions from the Lone Ranger to the Last of the Mohicans, and often these are images of people living in the Wild West, in rural areas, in harmony with nature. But as we see in your novel, there's actually an urban experience that's very different. Can you explain?
Yeah, I think for the past decade at least, 70% of Native people have lived in cities. And for the longest time, we've been only depicting Native people as being historical. And in order to be an authentic Native person, you look this one way. And it's always sort of this, you can see it in your head as soon as I ask you to think of a Native American, probably with a headdress, probably sad looking, and probably historical. And so I very much wanted to write a book that felt like right now and felt contemporary to resist this idea that we only exist in the past. Because, there's a lot of people living now who are Native and know their roots, and a lot of those people are living in cities, and there's a different story to tell that hasn't really been told very often.
And indeed, staying with this relationship with place, land and the exploitation of natural resources is at the heart of an ongoing struggle between indigenous peoples in Brazil and the country's current administration. President Jair Bolsonaro has said that native Brazilians have access to too much land in the Amazon and that he'd cut funding to initiatives which protect those communities. Claire Rush and Sophie Samai have this report.
In traditional dress, indigenous peoples sing as they gather in the Brazilian capital. Every year, thousands of natives come to Brasilia to call on the government to protect their rights.
It's never been more clear that if we don't keep our heads held high, they'll trample on our rights.
This year's so-called free land protest has taken on a new significance. Since taking office in January, President Jair Bolsonaro has rolled back tribal protections. He transferred the regulation of indigenous reserves to the Agriculture Ministry, where a powerful farm lobby has long opposed tribal land rights. The far-right president also placed the Indigenous Agency under the new Ministry of Family, Women, and Human Rights, led by an evangelical pastor.
The Justice Ministry used to oversee all indigenous affairs. Now, its responsibilities have been split up between various ministries. This weakens tribal rights overall.
In Parliament, opposition lawmakers and indigenous representatives have sounded the alarm.
Bolsonaro's government has launched more attacks against indigenous peoples than any other government since Brazil's transition to democracy. It's a serious threat, a turning point.
Brazilian activists aren't the only ones calling attention to indigenous rights in the Amazon. Artists around the world have also been standing in solidarity. Leonardo DiCaprio has supported the Waorani tribe in the Amazon in their fight against oil drilling. Meanwhile, dozens of celebrities, from fashion designer Vivienne Westwood to singer Julian Lennon, have backed a campaign by Survival International to protect the Awa tribe from illegal logging and ranching in the Amazon, a rainforest essential to the survival of hundreds of indigenous peoples.
So as we saw in that report, in Brazil, people are protesting against forest clearances and the implementation of a power line across indigenous land. And then elsewhere in the world, we're seeing that this climate emergency is becoming a priority for a lot of people. Do you think that indigenous people are involved enough in that movement?
I think where we can be, we are. I mean, we saw in Standing Rock, this is something that I think brought a lot of attention to Native authors post Standing Rock. We saw Native people standing up just for clean water, and we saw what happened once Trump got in. So there's different national park areas that are being opened up for land grabs through the Trump administration, and Native people are protesting where we can. We're a smaller number of the population and don't always have the ability to not work and feed families and go off and protest. Sometimes that's a privilege and not necessarily something that we can do.
Now, coming back to the book, one of the characters in There, Dean Oxendine, is involved in documenting the Native American experience through videos, and in a way it's a mirror of what you're doing, which is bringing a rare Native voice to the arts and culture mainstream. And this year, Yalitza Aparicio was the first Indigenous woman to be nominated for an Oscar for her role in the film Roma. How do you feel about that? Do you think the arts are really opening up to more diverse actors?
Yeah, I think it's something that's been happening over the past several years, but I think with the political climate has forced people to maybe pay even more attention. And I think people are not wanting to be on the side of what this administration in the U.S. represents. So I think you're seeing people pay more attention to diverse voices and to highlight diverse voices in a way that I hope is sustainable and not just sort of a trend. I hope it can continue in this way.
Because there's always the danger of tokenism, I think.
Is sometimes, if you're saying this is the Indigenous voice, it's really minimizing, and I think sometimes we don't get the same freedoms as let's say a white artist might be able to do whatever they want, and people from oppressed cultures and communities sometimes bear the burden of having to represent, in a way that it's not always put on privileged artists.
Mm-hmm. Now, indeed, that film, Roma, was notable for the use of Mixtec, the language that the character Cleo speaks, an indigenous language which predates the arrival of the Spanish in Mexico. Mixtec is an example of the sort of cultural heritage that UNESCO is looking to protect and promote in this year's International Year of Indigenous Languages. The initiative seeking to raise awareness around the 7,000 Indigenous languages spoken worldwide, of which some 2,500 are in danger. Well, UNESCO's Assistant Director General told us more.
The culture is endangered. People, they can live in their environment, in the rural environment, they can live in the urban environment. But what is important is just to protect their culture, their history, their traditions, and their languages. Of course, when it comes to education, which is a very, very important role in UNESCO, native languages has been and educating in native languages is one of the major programs that we advocate for.
Well, language can be a vehicle, an important vehicle for Indigenous culture in many ways. What about yourself? How important has it been for you? Were you encouraged to learn or speak your native language?
So my dad is a fluent speaker of Cheyenne, and it was his first language. He didn't speak English until he was 5 and got into school. And but when he raised us, he did not teach us the language. And we grew up hearing the language. He would speak it in phrases and words, but we didn't learn it in a formal way. My sister just became fluent, and me and my sister and dad are actually trying to translate my book as a way just to have it on as an archived piece, but also to help me learn. So I'm now trying to make efforts. It's so important. There's so much value embedded in language, and aspects of a culture are in language in ways that you can't know otherwise.
And it would be beautiful to see the book in that language as well. Now, I presume the most common case for people in the US and in Mexico as well is being bilingual, having both languages. And some of those people might identify as biracial or bicultural as well. How easy do you think it is today in the US to assume a so-called mixed identity?
I think more people feel a mixed quality than don't. We just had a biracial president, and that's not nothing. And I think a lot more people have the experience, even who aren't necessarily biracial. I think it's something that people intuit and understand. And I think even more so moving forward, we have to really advance our language around these complexities of the way cultures mix, and what to do, what to keep, and how to adapt.
Mm-hmm. Now, finally, we asked you to give us a cultural tip, something that we should go and see, hear, or read. And you pointed us in the direction of an exhibition on at the Smithsonian in Washington right now. It's called Americans, and it looks at how American Indian culture has shaped the country's identity. What was it that really struck you about that collection?
Well, it pairs really well with the prologue to my novel, and the curator for the museum gave me a personal tour of it. Something that struck me, that there's an entry from an Oxford English dictionary that shows that Native people were originally called Americans before Americans were called Americans. And this is part of why it's called Americans as an exhibit, because Native Americans was an added addendum later. Originally, they would call Native people the Americans. Different aspects of history that we think we know, and it sort of digs into that next layer.
Okay, well, it sounds fascinating. Tommy Orange, thank you so much for coming in today.
Thank you for having me.
We'll leave you with some of the highlights of that exhibition in Washington. And do remember, you can get more arts and culture on our website, and you can keep up with Encore on social media too. There's more news coming up on France 24 just after this.
look at a novel that has received much attention in recent months. Written by Native American author Tommy Orange, it sheds light on a group of people long stereotyped and often ignored. And again to Jeffrey Brown, who traveled to Oakland, California for the latest from our NewsHour bookshelf.
Diamond Park in Oakland, California. Tommy Orange spent hours here as a kid and now visits with his wife and son. He grew up down the street, the child of a white mother and Native American father.
Sometimes you feel like you belong right in the skin that you have, and sometimes you feel like an alien, and all the different spaces between.
Orange's acclaimed debut, There, is a novel of voices. A dozen characters exploring what it means to be Native American in an urban setting, not on a reservation.
I wanted to have the range of experiences for these Native characters, so different ages and different contexts and different struggles and backgrounds, various different proximities to their Native identity. Some struggle with it and some don't. So I wanted to have a range of what it means to be Native right now.
For 36-year-old Orange, an enrolled member of the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes, his Native identity came mostly through visits to his father's childhood home in Oklahoma. Back in Oakland, identity was more fluid, even concerning what an Indian is supposed to look like.
If I'm in the Fruitvale, like we are now, people will speak Spanish to me first.
Yeah, in this part of town.
Yeah. In high school, I was called racial slurs.
Racial slurs
it was,
for Indian?
It was actually Chinese racial slurs in high school, yeah.
And you were taken as Asian?
Yeah.
Wow.
So it's, I've been thought to be a lot of different things because I have, an ambiguity.
If slurs are thrown at you about being Chinese, what's your reaction to that?
Well, I got pretty angry, but it was also confusing. It's like, you can't even be made fun of, right?
After graduating from college, Orange worked in a variety of jobs, including here at Oakland's Native American Health Center. Returning with us recently, he was now a local celebrity. He became a reader late, he told me, and wasn't satisfied with the monolithic image of natives he found.
When people think the only way to be Native or the only way to look Native is based on a historical headdressed, feathered image, right, you're already disappeared. You're already gone before you can even start. There's something powerful about seeing yourself on the page or on the screen, and we don't have very much a good positive version of that. Native people we have a lot of stereotypes that we battle against, or negative ideas that we're dumb or we're drunk, or so I was sort of writing out of a loneliness.
What came out is being widely praised as an important new voice in American literature.
We know the sound of the freeway better than we do rivers, the howl of distant trains better than wolf howls. We know the smell of gas and freshly wet concrete and burned rubber better than we do the smell of cedar or sage or even fry bread. We ride buses, trains, and cars across, over and under concrete plains. Being Indian has never been about returning to the land. The land is everywhere or nowhere.
One of the characters in There, 14-year-old Orville Redfeather, explores his Indian heritage by looking online and watching videos on YouTube.
1, 2.
A contemporary way to learn what it means to be Native, and something Orange himself turned to for research.
In an urban setting, if you're not tapped into the community and you're not going to powwows, and for some of us, our parents weren't forthright about the history or our culture or our tribe, sometimes because of pain. So there's still that curiosity, and what better place is there than the internet if you're curious.
A powwow, in fact, becomes the destination that finally connects Orange's characters. He patterned it on real ones, large intertribal gatherings like this in Albuquerque, New Mexico.
It's intertribal, it's contemporary and traditional.
But he set his fictional powwow at the Oakland Coliseum, where he'd attended ball games in his youth.
You have a bunch of people coming together to dance and to sing and to drum, and there's an aliveness to being Native that you can feel there. I have my characters reflecting on like how to be Indian, how do you do it now? What does that mean? What does that mean if you live in the city? Two-part thing.
Orange studied and now teaches at the influential Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe. And he's just one among a new generation of writers and poets telling a new Native story. The goal now, he says, for himself and other writers, to sustain the momentum they're building and to keep telling stories.
Well, one of the functions of literature that I admire is when you can read like an intimate detail that a writer writes about and you have this feeling like, oh my God, I didn't know anybody else thought like that or did that. I want to be able to keep doing it and support my family and help other Native writers in the program that I teach in to get their work out in the world.
For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Jeffrey Brown in Oakland, California.
Some of the theirs, themes. See what I did there? Loss of culture, indigenous voice reclaiming their heritage, North America's hypocrisies dealing with indigenous and Native Americans, indigenous and Native Americans struggling with assembling identity. I think that's a strong thread and theme throughout the breadth of this novel. The idea that the characters within the novel find it hard because they were removed, and he covered that in his interview, removed from reservations to seek out a life in the urban center in cities, and then they felt alienated, from the reservation, but they felt like they hadn't have an identity in their white Western culture and society. So there's definitely some problems, especially with mixed race, which Tommy Orange is and some of his characters are within the novel, not understanding not what identity, what role they belong in. Other themes, control of one's destiny is elusive but achievable. Indigenous communities contain marginalized individuals. Depictions of indigenous characters are nuanced, complex, and extremely human, which obliterates pop culture's depiction of indigenous or Native Americans, what they are, what they seem like, how they're depicted in society. Pop culture can erroneously portray indigenous Native Americans as helpless victims lacking any free will. And then I tack this on at the bottom, but this is really literary theory. And we're going to speak about literary theory towards the end, one of the last parts of this lecture. The idea of Tommy Orange is writing through the literary lens or theory or prism even of Native American Renaissance, what's called Native American Renaissance, and recently coined Indigenous Renaissance in Canada. This sort of springing forth of Indigenous and Native American writers in the tradition of their culture. And we're going to speak about that ad nauseum, ad infinitum in a few minutes. But another part of that literary theory would be the structuralist theory of I-other binary oppositions that we spoke about with the prior text within this class. But it's definitely there. The I would be the Western society, Western philosophy, the majority of people occupying North America, which is, of course, white individuals, Caucasian. And then the other part of that binary, the other side of that would be the outsider, which would be Native American, African American individuals, in this case, in this novel, Native American. So just in a review of There, First Nations comedian, actor, and screenwriter Daryl Dennis said the following about Orange's novel, and I pulled from some language from that and threw it up here for you to see, the ones we just went over, and I added to it my own. Quote, this novel epitomizes the new voice of Indigenous writers that are using their platform to shed light on the past injustices of Indigenous people. Not to dwell on our victimization, but to ask the question, how do we take control of our own destinies? So that sort of speaks to order to really grapple with the idea of destiny, one's own self-direction. When they can extrapolate, if they can do that, they can extrapolate identity. Tommy Orange provides a sympathetic voice to his assortment of marginalized Indigenous characters, which they certainly are marginalized, while still providing critical examination of the hypocrisies that exist in our communities, particularly in the self-imposed Native leaders that take it upon themselves to speak on behalf of the entire Native experience. His writing is angry, graphic, and poetic, and I agree, delving into the imagery of Native spirituality without ever romanticizing it or falling into the stereotypical native mystic trap. And he does not do that. And that's not part of the Native American or indigenous Renaissance tradition. What is part of it is to not romanticize uh, and not fall into the stereotypical native mystic trap. Uh, but to write on the personal level with these characters. Most importantly, despite the violence and hardships depicted in the book, there is an overall sense of love and hope for the indigenous experience. And he covered that, Orange did, in the interview that we watched. He said, maybe there was some sadness, but it couldn't be defined by sadness because there also is a glimmer of hope for some of these characters. The book is filled with indigenous characters that are nuanced, complex, and extremely human. It is a depiction often lacking in indigenous stories, programs, and social media accounts that have derived their success from the depiction of our people, I'm quoting, as pan-Indian, helpless victims, and lacking free will. All right, so if you lack free will, you don't have a destiny, right? If you don't have a destiny, you can't have identity. If you don't have identity, you don't feel part of a society. If you don't feel part of society, you become, as we see here in the last bulletized point, the other, in the binary opposition. Orange, a member of the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes, was raised in Oklahoma area, as we covered. So a major theme that runs the breadth of this novel is the urbanization of the indigenous people. The title of the novel is a reference to Gertrude Stein's own depiction in her 1937 book, Everybody's Autobiography, of an attempt to return to her childhood home in Oakland, California, but finding that the rural Oakland she remembered was gone. She quotes in the book, there is no there. So in looking of where there was, it's not there anymore, she's saying. There is no there. For Native people, Orange writes that cities and towns represent, quote, buried ancestral land, glass and concrete and wire and steel, unreturnable covered memory. There is no there, unquote. Alcatraz Island and its prison also serves as a theme in the novel. A desolate institution that had no running fresh water or no electricity. These conditions were used as an example comparable to the conditions that many urban Native American reservations faced. Writing in the New York Times, Alexandra Alter described the book in terms of ambivalence and complexity, quoting Orange, himself a graduate of the Institute of American Indian Arts, as we've mentioned before, born to a Cheyenne father and white mother who converted to evangelic Christianity and denounced his father's spiritual beliefs. Quote, I wanted to have my characters struggle in the way that I struggled, in the way that I see other Native people struggle with identity and with authenticity. So think about these themes that we see listed here. The idea of identity, the idea of destiny, the idea of free will, the idea of being portrayed authentically as society, not as society sees you necessarily as an otherly, but being defined as who you are. And that's what Orange is doing with this narrative. Think about those themes and how you can use these themes to craft your own essays, your own thesis statement that you can research and pull and extract from that text examples of Orange applying these various themes. Speaking of characters, let's take a closer look at the novel's whole host of characters, and there are many. Okay, so plot and the panoply of characters. You can see a physical representation, and we're going to drill deeper on these in a moment, but a physical representation, a character map even, of the individuals and how they sort of play into the narrative of the novel and their placement within the stratosphere of the novel. Okay, the book begins with the essay by Orange, what's called the prologue, right? Anything that comes before that sets the landscape of what the novel's going to be is the prologue, and the epilogue is after the novel's over, after the denouement of a story, at the end of a story, what happens next. Then you get the epilogue, which tells us, what's going to happen. Now that things have happened, what's going to happen after that? So the book begins with the essay by Orange. I think it was an amazing essay, and it's so unusual to have an essay at the beginning of a novel, a fiction novel, right? It's detailing, quote, a brief and jarring vignettes revealing the violence and genocide that indigenous people have endured and how it's been sanitized over the centuries. So you'll find that it's tough. It's really hard. Human memory is a difficult thing with reciting and remembering history with great fidelity. So you can see here that history can be rewritten easily. We see it in our day and age. What truth is? What's objective truth? There's very few principles in this world that is objective truth. There's so much personal subjectivity when we recite the past and what truth is. And it can become, things in history can become romanticized and even sanitized. But Orange is not attempting to do that. He is attempting to show the ugly and grotesque underbelly of both society at large, but also the Native American community and how they've been sort of subjugated to this area. As the novel continues into fiction, it alternates just as a methodology of writing between first and third person perspectives. The point of view is sometimes first, sometimes third person. Following 12 Native American characters in the area of Oakland, California. So in that way, it seems like there's some autobiographical threads within this novel that Orange pulled from his own life, and that's hard not to do if you're a novelist, right? It examines one character named Blue with, quote, heartbreaking empathy as she describes how she initially remained with her abusive partner before finally leaving. Another, Thomas, who is an alcoholic and has lost his job working as a janitor, wrestles with a life lived suspended between his mother, who is white, and his 1000% Indian father, who is a medicine man. Okay, so now we're starting to see, you can see right there, just through that character, the idea of identity. One's grappling and struggling with the idea of who they are when they're straddling the line between their very Indianness, their very indigenousness, and part of this, their very whiteness. The characters face similar conflict throughout the novel. A teenager, Orvid Redfeather, turns to Google in search of the answer, what does it mean to be a real Indian? And in the mirror, wearing tribal regalia pulled from a closet, sees only a fake copy of a boy playing dress up. Calvin Johnson confronts his guilt at claiming to not be native at all, admitting, mostly I just feel like I'm from Oakland. Tony Loneman grapples with the fetal alcohol syndrome left to him by his alcoholic mother, which is tragic, while Octavio Gomez remembers alcohol through the drunk driving accident that claimed his family, and which is also equally tragic. And Jackie Redfeather faces sobriety from the perspective of a substance abuse counselor in the wake of her teenage daughter's suicide. Okay. One character struggles with his place in society as ambiguously non-white, so the idea of identity again, while another, overweight and constipated, has a graduate degree in Native American literature, but no job prospects. A living symbol of the moribund plight of Indian culture in the United States. So he's really trying to reflect some of the narratives that really do take place with Native American and Indigenous people in the United States. All storylines and the characters eventually coalesce. So they come together around a powwow taking place at the Oakland County Coliseum. Well, some characters have smuggled in 3D printed handguns in an attempt to rob the event to repay drug debts. So that's where we really reached the climax in the novel. There is, as we know, a complicated cast of characters within this novel, so it can be equally as complicated to keep track of them. Luckily, Orange was cognizant of this complication, so he, in an attempt to mitigate that complexity, structured the novel. So one can even talk about the structure of the novel, right? How he dedicated each new chapter to a different character, and that really helps ground us in the novel so we don't get lost. It does help to have a visual map, character map, as you see here, but it's tough to follow. Sometimes you got to read it a couple times, and I'm still sometimes struggle with keeping track of these characters. This character map was able to assist with that, though. So as we know, the book was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and a New York Times bestselling novel. The Pulitzer Prize committee commented that, quote, Orange's shattering novel follows 12 characters from Native communities, all traveling to the big Oakland powwow, all connected to each other in ways that may not yet realize. So maybe they're not aware of how connected they are, if you remember the novel, if you've gotten to that point yet. But it does coalesce. There is Jackie Redfeather, as we talked about, Dean Oxendine, who was pulling his life back together after his uncle's death, has come to work at the powwow to honor his memory. 14-year-old Orville has come to perform traditional dance for the very first time. Together, this chorus of voices tells of the plights of the urban Native American, grappling with the complex and painful history, with the inheritance of beauty and spirituality, with community and communal or sacrifice and heroism. Hailed as an instant classic, There is at once a poignant and laugh out loud funny. There are funny moments, utterly contemporary and always unforgettable novel. And I agree with that. I think it's a great sort of characterization of what this novel encompasses. Let's dig deeper, though, on this complicated situation that is the characters. Okay, so the panoply of characters, there's a ton for a novel. It reminds me of Game of Thrones, where it's just you get so many characters thrown at you that you almost need to make a visual representation of that mapping of characters. So I'm not going to go through all these, but just know that it's important. The weaving of the characters was an important element, them being individuals, but also coalescing at the powwow. Each of them struggling is a way building their characterization, right? He's building a narrative, he's building a theme, he's building a tone, a dark tone, dark theme, one of struggling, really attempting to represent what is really going on within the Native American community, the indigenous community within America. You can see the characters here. Please read through them at your will and at your convenience. Email me if you want me to I can throw this into a Word document, and if you want to use some of this for your own research within the second essay, and I'll email it to you. Let's take a look now at what we spoke about at the beginning of this lecture, the idea of Native American or the Native American Renaissance or the Indigenous Renaissance is literary theory and what that actually encompasses. Okay, literary tradition, Native American Renaissance. Pulled a lot of this information, as you can see here, off that web address at the bottom of that graphic. So finally, literary tradition that Orange is able to tap into through his novel is called the Native American Renaissance in America and Indigenous Renaissance in Canada. But they both subscribe to the same essential tenets. But what exactly is this type of Renaissance? The Native American Renaissance, I'm just give you some background information, is a term originally coined by critic Kenneth Lincoln in the 1983 book, Native American Renaissance, to categorize the significant increase in production of literary work by Native Americans in the United States in the late 1960s and onward. So it was a little bit ago, right, when this term was coined. So it's speaking on behalf of the proliferation of Native Americans, indigenous writers, really starting to produce, and not just writers, artists, really starting to produce their art, and not the art being just represented by white people in North America. Let's say, let's include America and Canada together in North America, right? So when this happens, when there's a resurgence of artists, to include authors, as we see here with Orange, you have to give it a name. And in this movement, it was a renaissance, a rebirth, right? We know what renaissance means. It was a rebirth. And there's many renaissance that exists. There was the African American Renaissance, the Harlem Renaissance, when African Americans were starting to produce, artists were starting to produce a lot of writings, starting to emerge within the artistic community. A. Robert Lee and Alan Velli note that the book's title, Quickly Gained Currency, is a term to describe the affluence of literary works that follow the publication of N. Scott Momady's very famous novel, House Made of Dawn, is what it's entitled, in 1968. So Momaday is probably one of the most important Native American writers of our time. Prior to the publication of House Made of Dawn, few Native American authors have published works of fiction that reached wide readership. At that point in the 60s, in the late 60s, I mean, it was all white writers, right? They were the main influence on literature. So in breaking ranks with that, we're able to enter the literary tradition of Native American Renaissance, Harlem Renaissance, and Indigenous Renaissance, which gives a greater understanding of the mosaic, of thought processes and phenomenon and history and culture within our society. In the work Native American Literature and Introduction, author Susan Lundquist suggests that Native American Renaissance has three elements. And I agree with these three elements, but I also really think the first one is really what Orange is really tapping into, whether intentional or not. I suspect he was very methodical in doing so, that he was infusing his novel with what I'm about to read. So the first one that really defines Native American Renaissance or Indigenous Renaissance is reclamation of heritage through literary expression. So reclamation of heritage through literary expression, what Orange is actually attempting to do and is successful at doing. He's capturing the culture of the moment, the zeitgeist of the Native American experience in America at this moment. So and attempting to have ownership over it and reclaim it, take it back, wrench it back, own it, and then in the hopes of hopefully creating identity once more. This urban individual that's been marginalized, who's part of the Native American community. What does that mean? What does it mean when the people have no land? They're not on the reservation anymore, so they're displaced. So that's part of identity as well. The second one that Lundquist points out as part of the Native American Renaissance tradition or the Indigenous Renaissance tradition is discovery and reevaluation of earlier texts by Native American authors. Okay, that's great. You reach back into the annals of history and you try to find other Native American authors and you review that to see what their point of view was, what they were writing about, what their subject matter was, and thrust it forward and try to amalgamate it into your own, sort of through intertextuality, the idea we talked about through postmodernism, borrowing an artifact from the past that has built-in meaning and infusing it in your own work in order to give it greater meaning, instantaneous meaning, because it already has that built-in meaning. And the third one is renewed interest in customary tribal artistic expression. There are moments of this, but as we said before, Orange is trying to avoid this, actually. So he's trying to avoid the idea of infusing mythology, ceremonialism. They're going to a powwow, so we do get that. The rituals, that's part of the powwow, and the oral tradition of narrative transmission, right? So spoken word history, spoken that they're able to keep as part of their narrative transmission. But he's avoiding the mythology, but really, I guess we are getting the ceremonialism and ritualism of the powwow that's infused in it. So we get to see, their Native Americanness in the novel. So Lincoln points out that in the late 1960s and early 1970s, a generation of Native Americans were coming of age who were the first of their respective tribal communities to receive a substantial English language education. So that's part of the resurgence of Native American Renaissance, right? Particularly outside Indian boarding schools and with more graduating from colleges and universities. Conditions for Native people, while still very harsh during this period, had moved beyond the survival conditions of the early half of the century. So this was the groundwork that was able to allow the perfect storm to happen for these individuals to rise up literarily and start writing on their communities as Native Americans and as Indigenous individuals. A period of historic revisionism was underway as historians were more willing to look at difficulties in the history of the invasion and colonization of the North American continent. As they explored the colonial and Wild West eras, some historians were more careful to represent events from the Native American perspective. The work inspired public interest in Native cultures within Native American communities themselves. It was also a period of activism within Native American communities to achieve greater sovereignty and civil rights. Wow, this definition, this representation, this characterization of Native American or Indigenous Renaissance, it really parallels and mirrors the Harlem Renaissance, which was all about African American people creating art, representing their culture correctly, and not being defined by the society that rules them, the white majority, but in establishing communities to achieve greater sovereignty and civil rights, as I just said about the Renaissance for the indigenous people. So they parallel each other greatly. If you wanted to write, if you want to do a comparative literature essay where you define how Orange's novel There is part of the Native American Renaissance or Indigenous Renaissance, and then you compare it and contrast it to the Harlem Renaissance and pick a writer from that era and compare and contrast. There's many. And then you would parallel them, maybe how they're a lot alike, in fact, and then give examples from the books from each text that you access. The ferment also inspired a group of young Native American writers who emerged in the field of poetry and novel writing. In the span of a few years, these writers worked to expand the Native American literary canon. By the 1980s, the rapid increase in materials and the development of Native American studies departments and programs at several universities, such as the University of California, Los Angeles, Dartmouth College, and Eastern Washington University, led to the founding of the scholarly journals such as SAIL, Studies in American Indian Literature. With the heightened interest in Native American writing, publishers established specialized imprints such as Harper's and Rowe's Native American Publishing Program, which had the goal of promoting new voices and publication opportunities. This is something we take for granted nowadays, but in the 80s, when we moved from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, that they were creating safe spaces, publishing houses that allowed, large ones like Harper's and Rowe's to allow them to give them space. That allows, if you give them space in their literary publications, you give them voice. And when you give them voice, you give them free will. When you give them free will, you give them identity. All these things are so connected. With regard to the Native American, the themes running through Orange's book and the Native American Indigenous Renaissance. Other meanings, and I think this is truly reflective in Orange's is an increasing prosperity and sense of achievement among Indians, a widespread economic and cultural rebirth. So cultural rebirth is something that definitely runs the breadth of the literary definition of Renaissance, a rebirth. For example, Joe Nagel applies the term to the totality of the, quote, resurgence of American Indian ethnic identification in the Renaissance of tribal cultures during the 1970s and 80s. So, wow, I think that is definitely something that Orange is doing. Native American Indian ethnical identification. So, identity, again, runs the breadth of this novel. Okay, questions as always. Uh, Please email me if you have any questions or any concerns. I think this is it's complex because of the whole host, the panoply I call it, of characters. It's complex in that way. But each chapter it is able to stand alone, right? Because it's a different character. And then we get to the chapters where it starts weaving those characters together. They coalesce. So it might be complex in that way. But once we get the characters down pat, we can understand the plot movements. Then we can understand what really Orange is doing. And we can start to pull the themes of identity, of free will, of one wanting to drive their own life despite being a marginalized part of the culture that you are immersed in. We start to parse those themes and think about too. I mean, the best essays will be writing on these themes that I'm talking about, but I mean, you could easily, and I give this as a default, you could easily push this essay through the lens of just what are the elements of fiction, what are the elements of poetry, because there are some, it does adhere to the elements of fiction and certainly has moments where it's very poetic. You could do that as well. That's fine. Note, next week we'll receive another lecture on There, but we'll also participate in the Blackboard discussion number 3, One Passage and Why. I think no, actually, I'm not caught up on grading for this class, but I will. You will, probably by the end of today, I'll be caught up, so you can check that out on Blackboard. And I'll also, for this Blackboard discussion, One Passage and Why, I'll send instructions early next week, so early on Wednesday rather, of how to do so. I think most of us are familiar with it. It'll be on the left-hand side of Blackboard, labeled Blackboard discussion number 3 or discussion number 3 for There. So look out for that. Email me again if you have any questions, concerns, or points of clarification. Thanks, guys. Bye.